The snow fell in thick curtains across Cedar Hollow, turning the small frontier town into a blur of white and gray. Lydia Grace Alcott pressed her face against the frosted window of the train car, watching the conductor's lantern bob through the storm as he made his way down the platform. Her breath fogged the glass, and she wiped it away with trembling fingers, knowing what was coming. "End of the line for you, miss." The conductor's voice cut through the whistle of wind when he appeared in the doorway. His eyes held no malice, only the weary resignation of a man doing an unpleasant job. "Ticket only paid through to Cedar Hollow." "Please." Lydia's voice came out as barely a whisper. She clutched the torn envelope in her lap, the one that had held her escape money until 3 days ago when she'd had to choose between food and the final leg of her journey. "California. I just need to get to California. My sister." "Rules are rules." He gestured toward the door. "Storm or no storm." The other passengers averted their eyes as Lydia gathered her worn carpet bag. A woman with 2 children pulled them closer, as if poverty might be catching. A businessman buried his face deeper in his newspaper. No one spoke as she made her way down the aisle, her dress catching on the rough edges of seats, the fabric so thin it might as well have been paper against the cold that rushed in through the open door. The platform was slick with ice beneath the new snow. Lydia's boots, already split along one seam, filled immediately with slush. She pressed herself against the depot wall, trying to find shelter from the wind that cut through her threadbare cloak like 1,000 tiny knives. The train's whistle shrieked once, twice, and then the great iron beast churned away into the storm, taking with it her last hope of reaching San Francisco before spring. She fumbled for the letter in her pocket, though she knew its contents by heart. Her sister Margaret's careful script, promising work at a respectable boarding house, a room of her own, a fresh start. The paper was soft from handling, torn where she'd gripped it too tightly during the worst nights of her journey. 3 months since she'd slipped away from the house in Missouri. 3 months of looking over her shoulder, of jumping at shadows, of remembering. No, she wouldn't think about that now. Couldn't afford to. Not when she needed all her strength just to figure out how to survive the night. The depot was locked, its windows dark. The ticket master had gone home to his warm bed, leaving only the wind to keep her company. Lydia tried the door anyway, rattling the handle until her hands went numb. Then she stumbled around to the side of the building, looking for any kind of shelter. Nothing but bare walls and drifts piling higher by the minute. Main Street stretched before her like a tunnel of shadows. The few street lamps that Cedar Hollow boasted were already being smothered by the storm. She could make out the shapes of buildings, a general store, what looked like a saloon, a hotel with a sign she couldn't read through the snow. The hotel, if she could just explain, maybe work for her room, wash dishes or... The clerk took one look at her and shook his head before she could even speak. "No charity cases," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "Try the church. Pastor William sometimes takes in strays." But the church was dark too, and no amount of knocking roused anyone. Lydia's hands had gone past numb to burning, and she could no longer feel her feet. She made it as far as the livery stable before her legs gave out. The door was barred, but there was a small overhang where the snow hadn't quite reached. She sank down against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. This was how it would end. Then, not in California with her sister, not in a new life where no one knew her name or what she'd run from, but here, in a town she'd never heard of until today, frozen like one of the cattle she'd seen standing in the fields, too cold even to lie down. She thought about praying, but couldn't remember the words. Instead, she whispered her sister's name, over and over, as if Margaret might somehow hear her across all those miles and come running. "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." The words turned to frost in the air. Her eyes had started to close when she heard the footsteps, heavy boots crunching through snow, coming closer. Lydia tried to shrink further into the shadows, her heart hammering despite the cold. Had he found her? Had Samuel sent someone? But no, Samuel wouldn't send anyone. Samuel would come himself, with that smile that never reached his eyes, with hands that knew exactly how to hurt without leaving marks anyone would ask about. The footsteps stopped. A lantern's glow cut through the darkness, and Lydia squinted against it, unable to make out the figure holding it. "You planning on freezing to death?" The voice was low, gravelly, but without the edge of cruelty she'd learned to listen for. "Because you're going about it the right way." She tried to answer, but her lips wouldn't work properly. What came out was more sob than words. The lantern lowered, and now she could see him. A tall man in a long duster, snow gathering on the brim of his hat. His face was all angles and shadows in the yellow light, weathered like old leather. He studied her for a long moment, and she waited for the questions. What was a woman doing alone? Where was her husband? Her father? Why was she dressed like a pauper and huddled in the snow like an animal? Instead, he shrugged off his coat and dropped it around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body, smelling of leather and tobacco and something else. Sage. Maybe, or cedar. The weight of it nearly made her cry. "I don't take charity from strangers," she managed to say, though her teeth chattered so hard the words came out broken. He was already turning away. "Then don't take it. Just borrow it until you're not dying." Where are you going?" He glanced back, and in the lantern light she caught a glimpse of eyes the color of whiskey, or autumn leaves, or the heart of a flame. "To get my horse, unless you'd rather walk a mile through this storm on those feet." She looked down at her boots, seeing for the first time how the snow had soaked through, how her skirts were frozen stiff as boards. When she looked up again, he was already disappearing into the swirl of white. He returned with a bay mare, the kind of sturdy, plain horse that could work all day without complaint, without asking permission. He lifted Lydia onto the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing. She should have protested. A lady didn't ride with strange men, didn't accept help from cowboys who appeared out of storms. But she was no longer sure she qualified as a lady, and her body had decided independently that warmth was worth more than propriety. He swung up behind her, one arm coming around to take the reins, the other steadying her when she swayed. "Name's Cullen Hart," he said, the words rumbling from his chest. "And before you ask, no, I'm not fixing to hurt you. Just don't cotton to finding frozen women when I come to town for supplies." Lydia wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but what came out was closer to a whimper. The horse moved forward into the storm, sure-footed despite the drifts. She let herself lean back slightly, just enough to steal some of his warmth. He didn't comment, just clicked his tongue at the mare and guided her onto what must have been a road, though it was impossible to tell where ground ended and sky began. "Got a name?" he asked after a while. "Lydia." She didn't offer her last name. Names had power, and she'd given too much of hers away already. "Well, Lydia," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that might have been amusement or might have been sadness. "Looks like you picked a hell of a night to visit Cedar Hollow." The rest of the ride passed in silence except for the wind and the steady breathing of the horse. Lydia dozed despite herself, jerking awake each time her head started to fall forward. Each time, the arm around her waist tightened just enough to keep her from sliding off. By the time they reached the ranch, she couldn't have said if they'd ridden 10 minutes or 10 hours. All she knew was that there was a building ahead, dark against the white, and then blessed. Blessed warmth as Cullen Hart carried her through a door and into a room where a fire crackled in the hearth. He set her in a chair that had seen better days, then went to work building up the fire. Lydia watched through eyes that wouldn't quite focus as he moved around the space, a single room that served as kitchen and living area, sparse but clean. No woman's touch anywhere, no pictures on the walls, no curtains at the windows, just the basics needed for survival. Like her, she thought, and almost laughed again at the comparison. Just the basics needed for survival. "Tea," he said, pressing a cup into her hands. Drink it even if you don't want to." The warmth hurt going down, waking up parts of her that had gone to sleep. Her fingers tingled and burned as feeling returned. Cullen Hart sat across from her, not drinking anything himself, just watching with those flame-colored eyes. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. He tilted his head, considering, why not? It wasn't an answer, but somehow it was enough. Lydia drained the cup, then let him refill it. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this strange sanctuary, she was beginning to believe she might actually survive the night. Her body wouldn't stop shaking, though, even with the fire, even with the tea, even with his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, the trembling came from somewhere deeper than cold, from months of running, from years of fear, from the knowledge that she was still so far from safe. "I can't stop shaking," she whispered, and immediately wished she hadn't. It sounded like weakness, like invitation, like 100 things she didn't mean. But Cullen Hart just nodded, as if women shook apart in his cabin every day, as if there was nothing strange about any of this, as if kindness from strangers was still possible in this harsh land that seemed to want nothing more than to break everyone who tried to claim a piece of it. The fire crackled, the storm howled, and Lydia Grace Alcott sat in a stranger's chair, in a stranger's house, wrapped in a stranger's coat, and for the first time in 3 months, let herself believe that morning might actually come. The morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, painting strange patterns on the rough wooden floor. Lydia woke in the chair where she'd dozed off, Cullen Hart's coat still draped over her like a blanket. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, the unfamiliar walls, the smell of wood smoke and coffee, the absence of fear that usually greeted her upon waking. Then it came back, the train, the storm, the tall stranger who'd pulled her from the snow. She sat up quickly, immediately regretting it as her body protested with a dozen different aches. Her feet throbbed inside her ruined boots, and her fingers were stiff as twigs. Cullen stood at the stove, his back to her, working at something in a cast-iron skillet. He'd changed clothes, or maybe she just hadn't noticed what he wore the night before. Dark pants, a gray work shirt rolled to the elbows, suspenders hanging loose at his sides, without his hat. She could see his hair was the color of old bronze, longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at his collar. "Coffee's on the table," he said without turning around. "Food'll be ready soon." Lydia reached for the cup, wrapping both hands around it. The warmth was almost painful against her still tender palms. "I should go," she said, though she had no idea where. "I've imposed enough." "Go where?" He turned then, and in the daylight she could see him more clearly. Mid-30s, maybe, with the lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. A scar ran through his left eyebrow, white against sun-weathered skin. "Storm's not done yet. Roads won't be passable for days." As if to prove his point, wind rattled the windows. Snow still fell, though lighter now, adding to the drifts that reached halfway up the walls. "I can't," she stopped, unsure how to finish. Couldn't stay with a strange man. Couldn't accept more charity. Couldn't explain why she'd rather freeze than be beholden to anyone, especially a man who looked at her with eyes that seemed to see too much. "You can and you will," he said, sliding a plate in front of her. Eggs, biscuits, a slice of salt pork, simple food that smelled like heaven. "Eat, then we'll figure out the rest." She wanted to argue, but her stomach had other ideas. The first bite nearly made her moan. When was the last time she'd eaten something hot? Something that wasn't bread gone stale or jerky tough as leather. Cullen sat across from her with his own plate, eating methodically, saying nothing. The silence should have been uncomfortable, but somehow it wasn't. It was the quiet of two people who understood that words weren't always necessary, that sometimes just existing in the same space was enough. When she finished, he cleared the plates without comment and went to a trunk in the corner. "These were my sisters," he said, pulling out a bundle of cloth. She won't be needing them. The way he said it, flat, final, told Lydia not to ask. She took the clothes, noting the quality of the fabric, the careful stitching. Whoever his sister had been, she'd had skilled hands. There's a room through there. He gestured to a door she hadn't noticed the night before. Was going to be hers. You can change, rest, whatever you need. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. A sampler hung on the wall, half finished. Needles still stuck through the fabric as if the seamstress had just stepped away and might return any moment. Lydia traced the letters with one finger. Home is where. But where what the sentence would never be completed now. She changed slowly, her cold, stiffened fingers struggling with buttons and laces. The dress was blue wool, warmer than anything she'd owned in years. It fit well enough, though she had to cinch the waist with a belt. When she looked in the small mirror above the washstand, a stranger stared back, a woman with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes. Hair that had once been her pride now hanging limp and dull. But alive, still alive. When she emerged, Cullen was sitting by the fire, working oil into a piece of leather tack. He glanced up, nodded once, then went back to his work. No comment on how the dress fit. No questions about her own clothes that lay in a sodden heap by the door. Just acceptance. Simple and clean as the room he'd given her. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but necessary. "No need." He held up the bridle he was working on, checking the bit. "Weather like this, work piles up. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're so inclined. Can't pay much, but room and board till the road's clear." Lydia understood what he was doing, turning charity into commerce, giving her a way to keep her pride. What kind of work? "Mending, cooking, whatever needs doing." He set the bridle aside, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm not much good at either, truth be told." She almost smiled. "I can cook and sew. Then we have an arrangement." That simply, she had a place, temporary, conditional, but a place nonetheless. She busied herself exploring the kitchen area, familiarizing herself with his supplies: salt pork, flour, coffee, beans, preserved vegetables, bachelor fare. But she could work with it, had worked with less. As she sorted through the shelves, she became aware of him watching her. Not the way Samuel used to watch, possessive and calculating. This was different, curious maybe, or just observing a change in his environment the way a man might note a new horse in the corral. "The limp," she said suddenly, then wished she hadn't. But he'd noticed her watching him move around the cabin, the slight hitch in his left leg, the way he favored that side. "Horse disagreed with me about which direction to go," he said easily. "Horse won." "When?" "Few years back, maybe more." He shrugged. "Days run together out here." She understood that. Time had become elastic since she'd left Missouri, stretching and compressing until she couldn't always say what day it was. What month, even. Only the seasons marked any real change, and even those seemed uncertain in this wild country. They fell into a pattern without discussing it. She cooked. He ate what she made without complaint. He worked on repairs. She mended what needed mending. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, like a well-worn coat. On the third day, when the storm finally began to ease, Lydia ventured outside to the small barn. The horse sage. Cullen had called her, nickered softly at her approach. She found a brush and began working through the mare's mane, the repetitive motion soothing. "She likes you." Lydia startled, not having heard him approach. Cullen leaned against the stall door, that almost smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She's a good horse," Lydia said, continuing to brush. "Best I've had." He moved into the stall, checking Sage's hooves with practiced efficiency. "Got her off a fellow who didn't appreciate what he had. Some people are like that. Can't see value when it's right in front of them." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply, but his focus was on the horse. When he straightened, though, his eyes found hers across Sage's back. "I'm not running from the law," she said suddenly, needing him to know that much at least. "Didn't think you were. But I am running." Figured as much. He patted Sage's neck. "Most folks who end up in Cedar Hollow are running from something." "Are you?" He considered the question, then shook his head. "Not running, just stopping. There's a difference." She wanted to ask what he was stopping from, but that would invite questions in return, and she wasn't ready. Might never be ready. Some stories were better left untold, especially the ones written in bruises and fear, and the slow erosion of self that came from living with someone who saw you as property to be managed rather than a person to be loved. That night, as she served the stew she'd made from rabbits he'd snared, Cullen cleared his throat. "Town'll be passable tomorrow, if you're wanting to move on." Lydia's hands stilled on the ladle. Move on to where she had no money for the train, no connections except a sister 3,000 miles away who might not even be expecting her anymore. The letter in her pocket was months old now. The situation it promised possibly long changed. "Or," he continued, not looking at her, "you could stay on a bit, till spring maybe, get your feet under you proper." Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why would you do that for a stranger? He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My sister, she showed up here 2 years ago, running from something too. Husband who thought his marriage vows included ownership papers. I told her she could stay as long as she needed." "What happened to her?" "Pneumonia. Last winter." His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his coffee cup. "Never even got to see the house finished. Was going to add on, make it proper for 2, for a family maybe, if she found someone worth trusting again." Lydia sank into her chair, understanding flooding through her. The half-finished sampler, the clothes that fit too well, the room waiting empty. She wasn't the first woman to find refuge here, and the ghost of the one who'd come before hung between them like morning mist. "I'm not her," she said softly. "I know that." He met her eyes then, and she saw grief there, old but not forgotten. "But you're here, and you need help, and I've got space. That's all this is, a fair trade, like I said." But it wasn't, and they both knew it. It was kindness disguised as practicality, generosity wrapped in gruff words and careful distance. It was an offer of time to heal, time to plan, time to remember who she'd been before Samuel had tried to reshape her into something else. "All right," she said, "till spring." He nodded once, the matter settled, and went back to his meal. Outside, the wind was finally dying, and stars began to appear between the breaking clouds. Lydia watched them through the window, thinking about trains and destinations, about sisters and second chances, about men who offered shelter without demanding payment in ways that left deeper debts than money could satisfy. Cullen Hart sat across from her, solid and quiet as the mountains that rose beyond Cedar Hollow, and Lydia Grace Alcott let herself believe, just for a moment, that she might have found a safe harbor in the storm of her life. Temporary. Yes, conditional, certainly, but for now, for tonight, for however many tomorrows spring might bring. It was enough. The fire crackled in the hearth, coffee cooled in their cups, and in the space between them, something began to grow. Not love, not yet, perhaps not ever, but understanding, recognition. The first tender shoots of trust between two people who'd learned the hard way that trust was the most dangerous gift you could give, and the most precious one you could receive. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Lydia sat curled in the chair, a blanket around her shoulders, trying to focus on the mending in her lap, but her hands wouldn't steady, and the needle kept slipping from her grip. Outside, wind howled through the gaps in the walls, a sound too much like the drafty house in Missouri, too much like nights spent listening for footsteps on the stairs. Cullen looked up from the harness he was repairing. He'd been watching her. She realized, had probably noticed every tremor, every failed attempt to thread the needle. Without a word, he rose and added another log to the fire, stirring the coals until flames leaped high again. "Storm's picking up," he said, though they both knew it wasn't the weather making her shake. The wind struck the cabin with renewed force, and something cracked overhead, a branch maybe, or ice breaking free from the eaves. Lydia flinched hard, the sewing dropping from her lap, and suddenly she was back there, back in that house with its thin walls and thinner excuses, where winter storms meant being trapped, meant nowhere to run when Samuel's mood turned dark as the clouds outside. "I can't." Her breath came short and sharp. The walls seemed to press in, the shadows reaching for her with familiar hands. "I'm sorry, I just—" "Hey!" Cullen's voice cut through the panic, low and steady. He'd moved closer but hadn't touched her, was crouched beside her chair with careful distance between them. "You're all right. You're here, not there. Whatever there was." Lydia pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to push back the memories, but they came anyway. Samuel's face when she'd spilled the wash water, the careful way he'd set down his newspaper, the smile that meant she'd be wearing long sleeves for weeks. The storm always made it worse. No neighbors close enough to hear, no excuse to go to town, just the two of them and his terrible patience. "My body's shaking," she whispered, hating how small her voice sounded, how broken. Cullen was quiet for a long moment. Then, soft as smoke. "Then sleep in my arms tonight." The words hung between them like a held breath. Lydia lowered her hands, met his eyes in the firelight. There was no hunger there, no calculation, just an offer of comfort from someone who understood that sometimes the only thing worse than being touched was being alone with your own memories. "I don't—" She stopped, unsure how to explain, that she hadn't slept through a full night in months, that she woke gasping from dreams where she never got away, where the train never came, where she was still trapped in that house with its locked doors and pretty curtains that hid so much ugliness. "Just sleep," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Nothing more. Sometimes a body just needs to know it's not alone." He moved back to his chair, giving her space to decide. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and Lydia found herself nodding, not trusting her voice. Cullen rose and walked to the bedroom, his bedroom. She realized she'd assumed he'd been sleeping by the fire these past nights. He returned with a thick quilt, spreading it on the floor near the hearth. No bed, no suggestion of one, just a warm spot on the boards, safe in the light of the fire. He settled first, his back against the wall, then held out one arm in invitation. Lydia hesitated, a lifetime of warnings echoing in her head. But stronger than the warnings was exhaustion, was the bone-deep need to not spend another night jumping at shadows. She moved carefully, awkwardly, unsure how this worked. In the end, she simply sat beside him, letting him draw the quilt around them both. His arm settled across her shoulders, solid but not confining. She could move away if she needed to. The knowledge of that freedom made it possible to stay. "My sister used to have nightmares," he said quietly. "First few months she was here. We'd sit up like this, watching the fire till dawn. Didn't fix everything, but it helped some." Lydia let herself lean into his warmth, just slightly. He smelled of leather and wood smoke, of coffee, and the faint sweetness of the tobacco he sometimes smoked on the porch. Safe smells. What was her name? Sarah. Sarah Elizabeth Hart. Stubborn as a mule and twice as smart. Fondness colored his voice, along with that ever-present grief. "She'd have liked you, would have said you've got backbone, showing up in a storm like that. Or that I'm foolish. Maybe both. Best people usually are." Despite everything, Lydia felt her mouth curve slightly. "Is that what you are foolish?" "Must be taking in strays in snowstorms, offering my best quilt to women who shake at shadows." But there was no mockery in it, just a gentle understanding that made her throat tight. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire dance. Gradually, Lydia's trembling eased. The warmth seeped into her bones, and with it came a drowsiness she'd been fighting for days, maybe weeks. "He used to wait for storms," she found herself saying. The man I was supposed to marry, said no one would come calling in bad weather. No one would interfere." Cullen's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders, not pulling her closer, just acknowledging, offering wordless support. 3 years, she continued, the words coming easier in the darkness. 3 years of being careful, of learning which floorboards creaked, which tone of voice meant danger, which days to make myself scarce. I got good at it, too good. Started to think maybe that was just how life was supposed to be. "What changed?" "He decided we should have children." The words came out flat, empty of the terror they'd once held. "Said it was time I did my duty. That's when I knew I had to run. Couldn't bring a child into that. Couldn't—" She trailed off, but Cullen seemed to understand. His hand moved slightly on her shoulder, just the smallest gesture of comfort. "You got out," he said. "That's what matters. You got out." "Did I?" Lydia pulled the quilt tighter. "I'm still running, still jumping at wind and shadows, still shaking like a leaf because a storm reminds me of him. How is that getting out?" "You're here, aren't you?" "Not there. That's a start." It was, she supposed, though some days it didn't feel like much of one. Some days, the distance between Missouri and Montana felt like nothing at all, like Samuel could walk through that door any moment with his patient smile and his careful hands, and his voice saying she belonged to him, had always belonged to him, would always. "Breathe," Cullen said softly. "Just breathe." She hadn't realized she'd stopped. Drew in air, let it out slow, again, again. The pattern of it, the rhythm, gave her something to focus on besides the memories. "Does it get easier?" she asked. "The running, the looking over your shoulder, does it ever stop?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Sarah was just starting to stop looking when the pneumonia took her. Just starting to believe she could have something different. "So I don't know if it stops, but I know it changes." Saw it in her, the way she started to stand straighter, laugh more, make plans past next week. "I can't even make plans past tomorrow." "Then don't make plans for right now, this minute, this breath." It sounded so simple when he said it like that, and maybe it was. Maybe that was the secret, not looking for some grand moment when everything would be fixed, but just surviving one moment, then the next, then the one after that. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Lydia found herself relaxing incrementally, muscle by muscle. Cullen's breathing was steady against her, his presence solid as a wall between her and the storm, between her and all storms. Maybe, at least for tonight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank me for." "There is, though." She turned slightly to look at him, seeing his profile limned in firelight. "You could have left me at that depot. Could have minded your own business like everyone else." "Could have," he agreed. "Didn't want to." "Why?" He considered this, his free hand absently straightening a corner of the quilt. "Maybe because I know what it's like to need shelter and not find it. Maybe because Sarah would have haunted me something fierce if I'd let another woman freeze. Or maybe—" He trailed off, and Lydia found herself holding her breath, waiting. "Maybe I'm just tired of this place being so quiet," he finished. "A man can get too used to his own company. Start talking to horses like they might answer back." It wasn't the whole truth, she sensed, but it was truth enough for now. She settled back against him, letting her eyes drift closed. The shaking had stopped. She realized, for the first time in months, her body was still. "Sleep," Cullen murmured. "I'll watch the fire." And somehow, impossibly, she did. Slept without dreams, without starting awake at every sound, without the constant tension of waiting for danger. Slept like she hadn't since she was young, before she learned that homes could be prisons and loves could be lies. When she woke, dawn was seeping through the windows and the fire had burned to embers. Cullen was still there, still solid and warm against her, though he must have been uncomfortable sitting up all night. His eyes were open, watching the light grow. "You stayed," she said, surprised. "Said I would." Simple as that, a promise made and kept, without fuss or expectation of reward. Lydia sat up slowly, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor, but it was a good stiffness, the kind that came from rest rather than tension. "I should make breakfast," she said. "In a bit," Cullen replied. "Sun's not full up yet." So they sat a while longer, watching the world wake outside the windows. The storm had passed, leaving everything clean and white and new, like a blank page, Lydia thought, like a chance to write something different. She didn't know what she'd write, didn't know if she'd ever stop looking over her shoulder or flinching at sudden movements. But for now, in this moment, with this quiet man who offered shelter without conditions and comfort without cost, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Enough to build on. Maybe enough to start believing that Sarah had been right, that standing straighter was possible, that laughing might come again, that plans past next week weren't just for other people. The sun climbed higher, painting the snow gold and pink and impossible blue, and Lydia Grace Alcott sat in a cabin in Montana, no longer shaking, no longer alone, no longer certain that the story of her life had already been written by someone else's hand. The morning routine had become comfortable in its simplicity. Coffee brewing while Cullen tended the horses. Breakfast eaten in companionable silence. Then the day's work begun without fuss or discussion. 3 weeks since the storm, and Lydia had found a rhythm here that felt almost like belonging. She was kneading bread dough when she noticed him favoring his left leg more than usual. He'd been out repairing fence posts in the north pasture, and the cold always made old injuries complain. But Cullen said nothing, just went about checking his rifle, preparing for an evening hunt. "There's liniment in the medicine chest," she offered, not looking up from her work. "I'm fine." "You're limping." "Been limping for years. One more day won't matter." Lydia shaped the dough into loaves, considering Sarah must have had these same conversations, must have watched him push through pain with stubborn silence. The thought made her bolder than she might otherwise have been. "How did it really happen?" she asked. "The leg." Cullen paused in cleaning the rifle barrel. For a moment she thought he'd deflect again, make another joke about disagreeable horses. Then he set the gun aside and settled into his chair, stretching the bad leg toward the fire. "Cattle drive," he said finally. 5 years back, maybe 6, was working for an outfit heading to Wyoming. Storm spooked the herd, caused a stampede. My horse went down. He said it simply, but Lydia could fill in what he left out. The terror of falling beneath those countless hooves, the desperate scramble for safety, the moment of knowing it was too late. "The other riders pulled me clear, but the damage was done. Broke in 3 places. Doc said I was lucky to keep it. And the horse," a shadow crossed his face, "had to put her down. Good mare, too. Deserved better than to die scared in the mud." The grief in his voice was old but still sharp, and Lydia understood. It wasn't just the leg he mourned, but the horse who'd carried him faithfully until that last, terrible moment. "Is that when you stopped driving cattle?" "More or less. Can't sit a horse 16 hours anymore. Can't trust the leg if things go bad." He shrugged, but she caught the loss beneath the gesture. "Bought this place with what I'd saved. Figured I'd try my hand at ranching small. Then Sarah showed up and, well, plans changed." Lydia covered the loaves and set them to rise. "Do you miss it, the drives?" "Sometimes. The freedom of it. No walls, no fences, just sky and grass and the work." He rubbed his thigh absently. "But a man can't live in the saddle forever. Body gives out eventually, whether you're ready or not." She thought of her own body, the way it still remembered Samuel's hands, even when her mind tried to forget. The bruises had faded, but there were other marks, invisible ones that ached in their own way. They sat in silence for a while, two people carrying damage that didn't show unless you knew where to look. "I used to sing," Lydia said suddenly. The words surprised her. She hadn't meant to share this. "In church, before I married. Had a voice people said was worth hearing. What happened to it? Samuel didn't like me drawing attention. Said a proper wife should be seen, not heard." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Funny thing is, after a while I couldn't remember the songs anyway. Like my throat just forgot how." Cullen's eyes were steady on hers. "Voices don't forget. They just get buried sometimes." "Maybe—" She turned back to check the bread, needing to move. "Or maybe some things once broken don't mend right, like bones." "My leg healed crooked," he said quietly. "But it still carries me where I need to go." The simple truth of it struck her. Not everything had to heal perfect to still be useful, to still have purpose. She'd been so focused on what had been taken from her that she'd forgotten to notice what remained. That afternoon, while Cullen was out checking his small herd, Lydia found herself humming, just barely, just under her breath. But it was there, a ghost of melody she'd thought lost forever. An old hymn her mother had taught her, about finding grace in unexpected places. She was still humming when he returned. Snow on his shoulders and color high in his cheeks from the cold. He stopped in the doorway, listening, and she immediately fell silent. "Don't stop on my account," he said. It was nothing." "Didn't sound like nothing." He hung up his coat, moving stiffly. The cold definitely wasn't doing his leg any favors. "Sounded like something trying to find its way back." Heat rose in her cheeks. "You said you can't sit a horse 16 hours anymore, but you still ride." "I do." "Even though it hurts." "Especially then." He lowered himself into his chair with careful movements. "Pain's just another thing to work through. Can't let it be bigger than you are." "What if it is, though, bigger than you?" "Then you make yourself bigger, or you find someone to stand with you till you can manage it alone." Like he'd stood with her that night by the fire, like he was standing with her now, in his quiet way. Lydia felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of bands she hadn't realized were there. "The men on that drive," she said, "the ones who pulled you clear, you keep in touch?" "No, that's not the way of it. Mostly, you work together for a season, watch each other's backs, then move on to the next job." He paused. "But I remember their names. Everyone. Man doesn't forget who was there when the ground was coming up to meet him." She understood that, too. She'd remember Mrs. Patterson, who'd slipped her the train fare when Samuel wasn't looking. The ticket agent who'd pretended not to notice she was traveling alone. Cullen, pulling her from the snow. These small kindnesses loomed larger than any hurt, if you let them. "I fell off a horse once," she offered. "When I was 12, my father put me right back on. Said fear would settle in my bones if I waited." "Smart man." "I hated him for it at the time. Cried the whole ride." A real smile tugged at her mouth, remembering. But he was right. Never was afraid of horses after that. Just of other things. Just of other things, she agreed. Cullen shifted, trying to find a comfortable position for his leg. Without thinking, Lydia fetched the liniment and a cloth. He started to protest, but she gave him a look that Sarah must have perfected, because he subsided. "This doesn't mean anything," he said as she knelt beside his chair. "Of course not. Just one broken person helping another, nothing more than that." But they both knew it was becoming more. Had been more from the moment he'd wrapped his coat around her in the snow. Not love. Perhaps. Neither of them was ready for that word. Might never be ready. But connection. Recognition. The kind of understanding that only came from surviving your own stampedes. She worked the liniment into the muscles around his knee, feeling the ridges of old scars beneath the fabric of his trousers. His breathing changed, deepened, but he said nothing, just watched the fire and let her tend to him the way he'd tended to her. "Sarah used to do this," he said after a while. "I'm not—" "I know, you're not her." His hand dropped briefly to her shoulder. Just a touch, then withdrew. "That's not what I meant. It's been a long time since anyone bothered to notice when something hurt." Lydia sat back on her heels, looking up at him. "We're a pair, aren't we? You with your broken leg, me with my broken everything else." "Could be worse," he said, and she heard a smile in his voice. "Could be broken alone." The bread had risen while they talked, and Lydia busied herself shaping it for baking. Cullen dozed in his chair, the lines of pain easing from his face. Outside, snow began to fall again, but gently this time, like a benediction. When the bread came out golden and perfect, filling the cabin with warmth and the promise of good things, Lydia found herself humming again, louder this time, almost brave enough to be called singing. Cullen's eyes opened, but he didn't speak, just listened with that quiet attention he brought to everything. She thought of her father putting her back on that horse, of cowboys pulling each other from beneath stampeding cattle, of voices buried but not lost, of legs that healed crooked but still carried you forward, of all the ways people could break and all the ways they could choose to keep going anyway. The humming became words. Just a few, just the chorus of that old hymn. Her voice cracked on the high notes, uncertain after so much silence. But it was there, still there, waiting all this time to be remembered. Cullen closed his eyes again, but his hand where it rested on the chair arm was relaxed, peaceful, like a man who'd found something he hadn't known he was looking for, like a man who understood that healing wasn't always about being whole again, but about learning to work with whatever pieces you had left. The snow fell, the bread cooled, and in a cabin built for one but holding two, broken people began the slow work of mending each other, one careful stitch at a time. The general store in Cedar Hollow smelled of pickle brine and leather, tobacco and peppermint sticks. Lydia stood before the bolts of fabric, running her fingers over practical brown wool, when she heard the whispers start behind the cracker barrels. That's her, the woman Cullen Hart took in. Living in sin, from what I hear, bold as brass about it too. Poor Sarah, barely cold in the ground, and already he's taken up with another. Lydia's hand stilled on the fabric. She'd known this was coming, had seen it in the sideways glances when she'd ventured into town with Cullen for supplies. Small towns had their own ways of enforcing propriety, and a woman living unchaperoned with a bachelor rancher was fodder for every gossip mill from here to Helena. Mrs. Brewster, the shopkeeper's wife, at least had the decency to address her directly. "Finding everything you need, Mrs. Alcott," Lydia said quietly, using the name she'd given herself on the train. "Let them think her a widow." It was easier than the truth. "Of course, Mrs. Alcott." The emphasis on the Mrs. was subtle but pointed. "And how are you finding your arrangement with Mr. Hart?" "I keep house in exchange for room and board," Lydia said, selecting a length of fabric she didn't really need. "Nothing more." "Certainly, though perhaps you might consider the Widow Pearson's boarding house much more suitable for a woman alone. More proper." Before Lydia could respond, the bell above the door chimed. Cullen entered, bringing cold air and the scent of pine. His presence filled the small store, and the whispers stopped as suddenly as if a door had slammed shut. "You about ready?" he asked Lydia, his tone easy but his eyes taking in the cluster of women near the preserves. Mrs. Brewster's pinched expression. "Almost." She handed her selections to Mrs. Brewster, who tallied them with unnecessary vigor. "Mr. Hart," Mrs. Brewster said, her smile thin as paper. "We were just discussing how unusual your current arrangement must be. For both of you. Nothing unusual about hiring help. Cullen replied mildly. Man's got to eat, and I never learned to cook worth a damn. Still, people do talk. A young woman, a bachelor. She let the implications hang like icicles. Cullen counted out coins for the purchase, his movements unhurried. People talked when I bought the Jorgensen place too, said I was a fool, that the land was played out, but my cattle seemed to be doing fine. He pocketed his change. Funny how talk doesn't amount to much when weighed against facts. He turned to Lydia. Got everything you need? She nodded, gathering her parcels. As they moved toward the door, she heard Mrs. Brewster's stage whisper, mark my words, no good will come of it. Outside, Lydia drew in a sharp breath of winter air. I'm sorry, I'm bringing trouble to your door. My door's seen worse trouble than wagging tongues, Cullen said, helping her into the wagon. Besides, they talked about Sarah too. When she first came, said I was a fool to take in a runaway wife. Said she'd bring her problems with her. Did she? For a while. He clicked to the horses, and they started the long road back to the ranch. But problems pass. Good people don't. They rode in silence through the white landscape, but Lydia could feel the weight of the town's judgment settling on her shoulders like snow. She'd fled one cage only to find herself hemmed in by different walls, the invisible boundaries of respectability, the narrow paths deemed suitable for women like her. You could let me go, she said softly. Find someone else to keep house, someone with fewer complications. Could... He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the road ahead. Won't. Why? You make good bread. Despite everything, she felt her lips twitch. That's your reason. Good reason as any. Then, more seriously, they don't feed you, Lydia. Don't let them define you either. The words echoed something he'd said before, and she wrapped them around herself like a shawl. But it was harder to ignore the whispers than to ignore the cold. Harder to stand straight when every eye in town was watching for her to stumble. That night, she burned the cornbread and oversalted the beans. Cullen ate without complaint, but she could see him watching her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands shook slightly as she cleared the table. It bothers you, he said. What they think. Shouldn't it? She scrubbed the pot harder than necessary. Your reputation. My reputation was set the day I dragged myself off that cattle drive with a ruined leg. Folks either respect me or they don't. What they think about my household arrangements doesn't change that. It's different for women. I know. His voice was gentle. But you already left one life because of what people thought you should endure. Don't let their opinions become another kind of prison. She turned to face him, hands still wet from the dishwater. Easy for you to say. You're a man. You have land, work, a place here. I have nothing but what charity provides. Is that what you think this is, charity? Isn't it? He was quiet for a long moment, then stood and went to the shelf where he kept his few books and important papers. He pulled out a leather journal, paged through it, then showed her columns of neat figures. Room and board for a housekeeper. He read. Standard rate in these parts. You've been here 6 weeks. By my calculation. We're about even, less the fabric today. You're actually a bit ahead. Lydia stared at the numbers, understanding what he was doing. You're keeping accounts. Course I am. This is a business arrangement. You said so yourself. He closed the journal. Nothing charitable about paying fair wages for good work. Cullen. You want to leave because you're ready to move on. That's one thing. But don't leave because Martha Brewster clutches her pearls when you walk by. Don't give them that power. She sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. I used to care so much about being respectable, about doing everything right, being above reproach. Look where it got me. Respectability's just another word for fitting into someone else's box. Cullen said, never saw much use in it myself. Sarah cared, though she was making that sampler, trying to build something proper here. Sarah was working on figuring out what proper meant to her, not to them. He moved to tend the fire, his movements careful. Took her time to understand the difference. Lydia thought about that half-finished sampler, the needle still stuck through the cloth. Home is where... But where what? What had Sarah been trying to say? I heard them compare me to her, she said. Poor Sarah, barely cold. And here you've taken up with another. Cullen's hand stilled on the poker. Sarah would have been the first to offer you shelter. Would have done it herself if she'd been the one to find you in that storm. He turned to face her. She had no use for women who tore each other down instead of lifting each other up. Said there was enough in this world trying to break women without them helping it along. She sounds remarkable. She was, but so are you. He said it matter-of-factly, like stating the weather. Different kinds of remarkable. Maybe, but remarkable all the same. Heat crept into her cheeks. I don't feel remarkable. I feel like a scandal waiting to happen. Then let it happen. Scandals blow over. Being frozen to death doesn't... The practicality of it made her laugh despite herself. He was right. In his way. She'd survived worse than whispers. Survived fists and threats, and the slow suffocation of a life that was killing her by degrees. What were a few wagging tongues compared to that? All right, she said. I'll stay. Let them talk. Good. He settled back into his chair with obvious relief. Because I wasn't lying about the bread. Best I've had since Sarah's... Different from Sarah's, but just as good. He met her eyes. Maybe that's the thing to remember. Different doesn't mean less than... just means different. The next trip to town. Lydia held her head higher. The whispers still followed her through the store, but she chose what she needed without hurrying, without shrinking. When Mrs. Brewster made another pointed comment about the boarding house. Lydia smiled pleasantly. Thank you for your concern, she said, but I'm quite content with my current position. Position? Mrs. Brewster repeated, making the word sound sordid. Yes, mister. Hart has been nothing but professional and proper. I'm fortunate to have found such steady employment. She left before the woman could respond, stepping out into the bright winter morning with something that felt almost like pride. Cullen was loading grain sacks into the wagon, and she saw him notice the change in her bearing. The slight smile that crossed his face was worth every whisper she'd endured. Get what you needed, he asked. Everything, she said, and meant more than just the shopping. On the ride home, she found herself humming again. Let them talk. Let them speculate and gossip and judge. She knew the truth of what lay between her and Cullen Hart. A careful friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding. Nothing more, not yet, maybe never, but nothing less either. And that was enough. Enough to build on. Enough to defend against the narrow minds of Cedar Hollow. She'd learned to survive violence. She could certainly survive disapproval. That's new, Cullen said, referring to her humming. Old, actually, just remembering how it goes. He nodded. Understanding, as always, the weight of small resurrections. Good to have music on the place again. Been too quiet. So she hummed louder, letting the melody fill the space between them and drift out over the snow-covered hills. Let the town talk. Here, in this wagon, on this road, with this man who offered respect instead of ownership. She was building something that belonged to no one but herself. And that was the most scandalous thing of all. A woman choosing her own way, regardless of what anyone thought she should do. The horses plodded steadily homeward, and Lydia Grace Alcott hummed an old song made new. While beside her, Cullen Hart smiled and said nothing at all, which was exactly what she needed to hear. The storm arrived without warning, turning the afternoon sky black as char. Lydia had been in the barn, checking on a calf with a wounded leg, when the first wind struck. By the time she made it back to the cabin, snow was falling so thick she could barely see the porch steps. Cullen was still out on the range, had left that morning to bring in some strays before the weather turned. But the weather had turned faster than expected, and now night was falling with no sign of him. She lit every lamp, placed one in each window like beacons. The wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, and with each gust, the walls shuddered, just like the house in Missouri during winter storms. Just like those nights when Samuel would sit in his chair, watching her, waiting for any excuse to... No. She pressed her palms flat against the table, forcing herself to breathe. This wasn't that house. Cullen wasn't Samuel, but her body didn't know the difference, responded to the storm with the same bone-deep terror that had kept her awake so many nights. The windows rattled in their frames. Something crashed outside, a loose board from the barn, maybe, or a tree branch giving way under snow. Lydia flinched hard, knocking over her teacup. The sound of shattering ceramic made her freeze, remembering other broken things, other punishments for clumsiness. "Stop it," she whispered to herself. "Stop it, stop it, stop it." But the memories came anyway, rolling over her like the storm itself. Samuel's face when she'd broken his mother's serving dish, the careful way he'd collected every piece, made her watch as he counted them. One shard for each day she'd have to earn forgiveness. The storm had been just like this one, trapping them together with nowhere for her to run when his hands... A door slammed. Not the cabin door, the barn. Cullen. He must be seeing to the animals before coming in. The relief nearly dropped her to her knees. But an hour passed, and he didn't appear. Lydia paced the small space, peering out windows crusted with ice. The barn was invisible through the snow. Might as well have been miles away instead of yards. Something was wrong. He'd never stay out there this long, not in weather like this. She should wait, should stay inside where it was safe, where the walls could protect her from more than just wind. But Cullen had pulled her from a storm once, had offered shelter without question, without price, and now he was out there. Maybe hurt, maybe needing help he was too stubborn to ask for. Lydia wrapped herself in layers, 2 shawls, Cullen's spare coat, anything to armor herself against the cold. She tied a rope around her waist, the other end to the porch post. Stories of people lost between house and barn, found frozen feet from their own door, were too common to ignore. The wind hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath, her balance. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling when walking proved impossible. The rope was her lifeline, her only orientation in the white blindness. Her skirts tangled, dragged, became heavy with snow. Still she pressed on, feeling her way inch by inch. The barn wall appeared so suddenly she ran face first into it, following it by touch. She found the door, had to throw her whole weight against it to open it against the wind. Inside was darkness and the warm smell of animals, blessed relief from the storm's fury. "Cullen!" Her voice came out cracked, thin. A groan from the back stalls. She fumbled for the lantern kept by the door, fingers numb and clumsy with cold. When light finally bloomed, she saw him slumped against Sage's stall, one hand pressed to his side. "Got kicked," he said through gritted teeth. "Damn fool horse spooked when the roof beam came down. Think it cracked a rib or two." Lydia knelt beside him, saw the careful way he was breathing, the pain etched in every line of his face. "We need to get you inside." Tried. Can't make it through the storm like this." "Then we stay here until it passes." "You should go back. No sense both of us." "Hush!" She was already moving, gathering horse blankets, hay, anything to create shelter within shelter. "I'm not leaving you?" His laugh turned into a cough that made him pale. Stubborn woman. Learned from the best. She built a nest of sorts in an empty stall, helped him crawl into it, though every movement made him bite back sounds of pain. The horses stamped and whickered nervously as the storm shook the barn. But their presence was oddly comforting, warm life surrounding them in the cold dark. Lydia settled beside him, pulling blankets over them both. He was shivering now, shock or cold or both. Without thinking, she wrapped her arms around him, offering her warmth as he'd once offered his. "This is backwards," he muttered against her shoulder. "I'm supposed to be the one doing the rescuing." "Take turns," she said. "Only fair." The wind found every gap in the barn walls, sent snow swirling through the slats, but wrapped together in their makeshift shelter, it was bearable. More than bearable. Lydia felt the fear that had gripped her all evening starting to ease. This storm couldn't reach her here. Not really. Not with Cullen's solid presence beside her, his breath warm against her neck. "You came out in this," he said after a while, wonder in his voice. "Could have stayed safe inside. You would have frozen." "Maybe. Still," his arm tightened around her waist. "That took courage." "Or foolishness. Best people are usually both. Remember," she smiled against his shoulder. "Guess that makes us the best people, then." They dozed fitfully, waking when the wind gusted particularly hard, or when Cullen shifted wrong and pain stole his breath. During one of the quiet spells, he spoke into the darkness. "Sarah hated storms like this. Said they made her feel trapped." She wasn't wrong. Lydia's fingers found his, intertwined. "Storms have a way of making walls feel like cages. Is that what you were running from, feeling trapped?" She considered how much to say, but here in the dark, with the storm raging outside and his pain making him vulnerable, truth seemed the only currency worth trading. "He never hit me where it would show," she said quietly. "Samuel. My intended, he was careful about that. Said a man who marked his woman where others could see was no better than an animal. He had methods, ways to hurt that didn't leave bruises anyone would ask about." Cullen's breathing changed, but he said nothing, just held her a little tighter. "Storms were the worst. No chance of visitors, no reason to go to town, just him and me and all that time to fill." She swallowed hard. "The night I left, there was a storm coming. I saw it building on the horizon, and I knew I couldn't survive another one. So I took what money I'd hidden and ran. 3 years of planning, and in the end it was just the weather that decided it." "You got out," Cullen said, echoing his words from weeks ago. "That's what matters." "I almost didn't. Almost turned back a dozen times. Keeping a devil you know seems safer than facing the unknown." She laughed, but it was brittle. "Then I nearly froze to death in Cedar Hollow. So maybe I should have stayed after all."
"No!" The word came out fierce. "Don't say that! Don't ever say that!"
"Why does it matter to you?" She pulled back enough to see his face in the dim light. "Really, Cullen, not the pretty answer. Why do you care what happens to me?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I know what it's like to be broken by someone else's choices. Not the same way as you, but broken all the same." "The stampede. Before that, during..." He shifted carefully, protecting his ribs. "The trail boss, McKenna. He was drunk when he ordered us out that night. Storm coming, cattle restless. Every hand with sense saying we should wait for daylight. But McKenna wanted to prove something, show he could handle anything. So out we went." Understanding dawned cold. He caused it, the stampede. His pride caused it. His need to be seen as tough, in control. Cost me my leg. Cost Beth her life. Cost 2 other men their futures. His voice was steady, but she could feel the old anger beneath it. "And you know what he said after Saeed, it was the price of doing business. Said we knew the risks when we signed on." "What happened to him?" "Nothing. Finished the drive. Collected his pay. Probably drunk in some saloon right now. Telling stories about the time he brought a herd through despite hell and high water." He touched her face gently. "So I know about people who break others because they can. Know about carrying damage someone else inflicted. And I know it wasn't your fault, any more than that stampede was mine." The wind howled, and Lydia pressed closer. "I still flinch, still wake up afraid, still shake at storms. My leg still hurts, still can't ride like I used to, still dream about hooves and mud." He rested his forehead against hers. Doesn't mean McKenna wins. Doesn't mean your Samuel wins either. When does it stop feeling like they're winning? When you realize you're living despite them, not because of them. When you make choices they'd hate and don't care what they'd think about it. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. When you crawl through a blizzard to save someone, even though storms terrify you, that's not letting them win. That's telling them to go to hell in the most eloquent way possible. She laughed, surprising herself. Is that what I did? Among other things. He winced as another gust shook the barn. Though next time maybe we could tell them to go to hell from inside where it's warm. Deal. They stayed wrapped together as the storm gradually wore itself out. By dawn, the wind had died to whispers, and pale light filtered through the cracks. Cullen's breathing was easier, though she could see the bruises blooming across his ribs when she helped him sit up. Think we can make it to the house now? She asked. Only one way to find out. They made it, though barely, stumbling through knee-deep drifts, stopping every few feet for Cullen to catch his breath. But they made it together, neither letting the other fall. And when they finally collapsed before the cold hearth, Lydia felt something triumphant singing in her chest. She'd faced the storm, faced her fear, chosen to walk into the very thing that terrified her most, and survived. More than survived, she'd saved someone, saved Cullen as he'd saved her, evening the scales between them. As she built up the fire and heated water for tea, Cullen watched from his chair. You're humming again. She was, she realized. Seems I am. What song? I don't know. Maybe a new one. Maybe one that hasn't been written yet. He smiled despite his pain. I'd like to hear it when you figure it out. You will, she promised, and knew she meant it. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and white and full of possibility. And Lydia Grace Alcott, who'd once lost her voice to fear, hummed louder as she worked, filling the cabin with melody and hope and the quiet certainty that some storms were worth walking through. If you found the right person to walk beside. The Chinook winds came early that year, warm breath from the mountains melting snow in sudden rushes. Water ran everywhere, dripping from eaves, pooling in low places, turning the ranch yard to mud. Lydia stood on the porch, watching winter's grip loosen day by day, and felt something similar happening in her chest. The river'll be high soon, Cullen said, joining her with his morning coffee. His ribs had healed, though he still moved carefully on cold mornings. Always floods that bottom pasture when the melt comes this fast. Will the cattle be all right? Moved them to higher ground yesterday. He sipped his coffee, studying the sky. Spring's coming whether we're ready or not. Spring. The word sat heavy between them. She'd promised to stay until spring, until the roads cleared, until she could make her way to California. That time was racing toward them now with the melting snow. I've been thinking, he said, then stopped. Dangerous habit. So I'm told. But he didn't smile. Been thinking about the future, about what happens when... He trailed off as a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast despite the muddy road. As the figure drew closer, Lydia's blood turned to ice. She knew that seat, that way of holding the reins. Even after months and miles, she knew. Get inside, she whispered. Lydia, please, get inside. Lock the door. But it was too late. Samuel Treadwell had seen her, was already dismounting with that controlled grace she remembered too well. He looked exactly the same neat brown beard, clothes pressed despite the journey. Eyes that smiled while calculating the price of everything they saw. Lydia, my dear, he said, as if months hadn't passed, as if she'd simply stepped out for air. What a chase you've led me on. Mr. Treadwell, her voice came out steady somehow. You're far from home. As are you. His gaze flicked to Cullen, cataloging, measuring. Though I see you've found accommodations. Cullen shifted slightly, putting himself between them. Don't believe we've been introduced. Samuel Treadwell, Lydia's intended. He said it like stating ownership, like showing a bill of sale. I've come to bring her home where she belongs. Funny, don't recall her mentioning any intention toward you. Samuel's smile tightened. Lydia can be confused sometimes, prone to fits of nerves, woman's hysteria. The doctor called it. I've been most patient with her condition. I'm not confused, Lydia said, finding her voice. And I'm not going anywhere with you. Now, Lydia. Samuel's tone was patient, patronizing, the voice he used when explaining why she needed correction. You're not well. This fantasy you've been living, running off, taking up with strange men, it's all part of your illness. But I forgive you. We'll go home, and everything will be as it was. No. I wasn't asking. The patience cracked slightly, showing the steel beneath. Your father signed the marriage contract. You belong to me under law and God. This man has no claim on you. Nobody has a claim on her, Cullen said quietly. That's not how it works out here. Samuel's eyes narrowed. I see. You've been filling her head with frontier nonsense, making her forget her place, her duties. He took a step forward. I could have you arrested for harboring a runaway, for corrupting a woman promised to another. You could try. Cullen's hand moved casually to rest on his hip, near the gun he always wore. But the sheriff's a friend of mine. Might be interested to hear why a lady felt the need to run thousands of miles to escape her intended. Lydia. Samuel turned his attention back to her, voice dropping to the intimate tone that used to make her stomach clench. Remember what we discussed about your behavior, about consequences, about what happens to women who forget themselves. The old fear rose, choking her. How many times had she heard that voice, that careful threat wrapped in concern? How many times had she submitted just to make it stop? But then she felt Cullen beside her, solid and steady. Remembered crawling through a blizzard, remembered her own voice singing in this very kitchen, remembered that she'd survived the leaving and the running and the starting over, and she'd be damned if she'd go back now. I remember everything, she said, stepping forward. I remember the cellar where you locked me when I spoke out of turn. I remember the corrections that left me unable to sit for days. I remember you explaining how stupid I was, how lucky to have your guidance, how no one else would want such a damaged, willful woman. Lydia, warning in his voice now. I remember it all, Samuel, and I'm done being afraid of it, of you. She lifted her chin. I'm not going back, not now, not ever, and if you try to force me, I'll tell everyone in Cedar Hollow exactly what kind of man you are. Every detail, every correction, every night I spent praying you wouldn't come to my room. His face went dark. You wouldn't dare. No one would believe you. Maybe not back home, but out here. She gestured to the wide landscape. Out here, people judge a man by his actions, not his reputation. And they've seen me, seen what I was when I arrived, half frozen, terrified, jumping at shadows. They'll believe me. You're making a mistake. His mask of civility was slipping. You think this man wants you damaged goods, another man's leavings. He's using you, and when he's done, the sound of Cullen cocking his rifle cut through the air like thunder. That's enough, Cullen said, voice calm as deep water. Lady said she's not going with you. Discussion's over. You'd threaten me over her. I'd defend my home from an unwelcome visitor. Nothing personal about it. Samuel stood very still, calculating. Lydia knew that look, had seen it when he decided whether the satisfaction of punishment outweighed the inconvenience of questions. Finally, he stepped back. This isn't over, he said. I have legal rights. Papers. Paper burns real easy out here, Cullen observed. Samuel's jaw worked. Then he turned to Lydia, and for the first time, she saw something beneath his controlled surface. Not love, she'd never fooled herself about that, but loss of control, of the ordered life he'd planned where she played her assigned role.
"You'll regret this," he said. "When you're old and alone, when no decent man will have you, when you realize what you've thrown away."
"I'll remember this moment," she interrupted. "When I stood on my own land, yes, my land, because Heart's teaching me ranching and I mean to have my own place someday. When I told you no and meant it. When I chose my own life over your cage." She took a breath. "That's what I'll remember." Samuel mounted his horse without another word, but at the gate, he turned back. "I know where you are now. That won't change." "Neither will my answer," Lydia called back. He rode away, figure growing smaller against the vast sky until he was just a speck, then nothing, gone, but his presence lingered like smoke. Lydia's knees gave out. Cullen caught her, lowered her gently to the porch steps. Her whole body was shaking, but not from fear this time. From something else. Release maybe, or recognition of what she'd just done. "You all right?" "I don't know." She laughed, high and slightly wild. Did I really just do that?" "You did. Stood up to him like you were 10 feet tall and bulletproof." "I don't feel bulletproof. I feel like I might be sick." "That's normal. Courage always feels like that after." She looked up at him. "What if he comes back?" "Then we deal with it. Together." He sat beside her, careful not to crowd. "Though I don't think he will. Men like that are cowards at heart. They want easy victims, not fights." "You'd have shot him." It wasn't a question. "If he'd tried to take you, yes." The simple certainty of it made her throat tight. "Why?" "Because you said no. That should be enough for any man to hear." He paused. "And because I've gotten used to your cooking. Be ashamed to go back to my own burnt offerings." She laughed, despite everything. "That's twice now you've justified saving me with my kitchen skills." "Well, they are considerable skills." They sat in silence, watching the empty road. The Chinook wind played with loose strands of her hair, carrying the scent of earth waking up, of green things stirring beneath the snow. "I meant what I said," she said eventually, "about having my own place someday." "I know. Not that I'm ungrateful. You saved my life, gave me shelter, taught me—" "Lydia." He waited until she looked at him. "You don't owe me anything. Not gratitude, not explanations, not staying somewhere you don't want to be." "What if I want to be here?" The word surprised them both. Cullen went very still. "Not as your housekeeper," she continued, needing to explain. "Not as charity or obligation, but as, I don't know, learning, building something." She gestured helplessly. "I don't have the words right." "Words don't matter so much as intentions." "Then intend to stay, for now. To learn ranching, like you said. To figure out who I am when no one's telling me who to be." She met his eyes. "If that's acceptable to you." "More than acceptable." Something in his face softened. "Place could use more than one person's dreams. Even if those dreams involve me eventually having my own land, being a neighbor instead of..." "Instead of what?" She couldn't say it, couldn't name the other possibility, the one that had been growing between them like spring grass. Not yet, maybe not ever, but it was there, waiting, patient as the mountains. "Good neighbors are hard to find," he said when she didn't answer. "I'd be honored to have you as one, when you're ready. And until then, we take it day by day, season by season, see what grows." It was enough, more than enough. Lydia stood, legs steady now, and offered him a hand up. "Come on, I'll make tea. We can discuss what needs doing now that spring's coming. Fences to mend, calves to brand, garden to plant if you're wanting one." "I am Sarah's seeds. Are they still good?" "Should be." She was careful about storing things proper. They went inside together, leaving the door open to let in the warm wind. Samuel Treadwell was already fading like a bad dream. His power broken by the simple act of refusal. He might return, might try again, but Lydia knew now that she could face him. could stand her ground with Cullen beside her and her own strength beneath her. Spring was coming to Montana, and with it the chance to plant new things. Not just gardens, but hopes. Not just crops, but futures. And Lydia Grace Alcott, who'd arrived frozen and afraid, was ready to see what might bloom in this wild, generous earth that asked nothing of her but honest work and the courage to keep growing. The tea was hot and strong, and they drank it while discussing practical things, seed orders and fence lines and the best spot for vegetables. But underneath the ordinary words ran a deeper current, a recognition that something had shifted. The last chain to her old life had been faced and broken. What came next was entirely hers to choose, and that, more than any rescue or shelter or protection, was the greatest gift of all. The dust hadn't settled from Samuel's departure when another rider appeared 3 days later. This time, Lydia recognized the horse before the man, a flashy palomino that belonged to Judge Morrison from town. Her stomach clenched. Samuel had mentioned legal rights, papers. Had he gone to the law after all? But when Judge Morrison dismounted, his face was grave rather than official. "Miss Alcott, Mr. Hart, I'm afraid I have some news." "If Treadwell's filed some complaint," Cullen began. But the judge raised a hand. "No, nothing like that. It's about Treadwell himself." He removed his hat, worried the brim. "He's dead. Found him this morning at the bottom of Widow's Canyon. Horse came back to town without him." Lydia felt the world tilt. Dead. Appears his horse spooked. Maybe a snake, maybe something else. That trail's treacherous even in good weather. And we had rain 2 nights back. The judge's eyes were knowing. He'd been drinking, according to Tom at the saloon, quite heavily, talking about ungrateful women and frontier justice. "I see," Cullen said carefully. "Thought you should know, given he'd been out here causing trouble." Morrison looked directly at Lydia. "You're free of him now, ma'am. Whatever claim he thought he had died with him." After the judge left, Lydia sank into a chair. She waited to feel something, relief, guilt, sorrow, but there was only a strange hollowness, like an echo in an empty room. "You all right?" Cullen asked. "I don't know what to feel. Is that wrong, that I don't feel more?" "Nothing wrong about it. Man made his choices. Last one was riding drunk on a dangerous trail." "He came all this way." She stared at her hands. "Spent months tracking me down, and for what, to die alone at the bottom of a canyon. Some men can't let go of what they think they own. Kills them in the end, one way or another." She thought about Samuel's face when she'd defied him. The disbelief, the rage barely held in check. Had he been thinking of her when his horse went over? Had her refusal driven him to that bottle, that reckless ride? "It's not your fault," Cullen said, reading her thoughts. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not your fault." "I know. I think I know. It's just—" She struggled for words. 3 years I lived in fear of him. Built my whole life around avoiding his anger, predicting his moods. And now he's just gone, like he was never the monster I made him in my mind. He was exactly the monster you knew him to be. Death doesn't change that, doesn't make him noble, just makes him dead." The bluntness of it surprised a laugh out of her. "Sarah was right. You don't pretty things up, do you?" "Never saw the point. Truth's hard enough without decorating it." That night, she couldn't sleep. Kept seeing Samuel's face, but younger, the way he'd looked when they'd first met. He'd seemed so charming then, so sure of himself. When had it changed, or had the darkness always been there? Waiting. She found Cullen on the porch, smoking his pipe in the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Too many ghosts." She settled beside him, pulling her shawl tight. "Is it wrong that part of me is glad that I feel free?" "Nothing wrong with feeling free of someone who hurt you. The preacher would say I should forgive, pray for his soul." "Preachers say a lot of things. Doesn't make them true for everyone." He passed her the pipe, and she took it, surprising herself. The tobacco was sweet, calming. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the dead. When you're ready, if you're ever ready. Were you ready to forgive McKenna? No, still haven't, maybe never will. He took the pipe back. But I don't carry him with me every day anymore. That's enough. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear between clouds. The night was mild. Spring fully arrived now, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang to its mate. I need to write to Margaret, Lydia said eventually. Tell her, I don't know, tell her something. Tell her you're safe. That's what matters. Am I safe? He turned to look at her. You are. Here, you are. The certainty in his voice made her throat tight. For how long? Long as you want, forever, if that suits you. Forever. The word hung between them like a promise. She'd never thought in terms of forever, had learned to survive day by day, hour by hour. But now, with Samuel gone and spring blooming around them, forever seemed possible. I still want my own place, she said. Someday. I know. But not yet. I'm not ready yet. No rush. Land's not going anywhere. She looked at him in the starlight. This quiet man who'd offered shelter without conditions, who'd stood between her and danger, who understood that some wounds took time to heal and some dreams took time to grow. Cullen. Thank you for everything, for being here, for not asking questions I couldn't answer, for... She gestured helplessly. For seeing me as more than what happened to me. Lydia. He waited until she met his eyes. What happened to you is part of your story, but it's not your whole story. Never has been. What's the rest of my story then? Don't know yet. That's the interesting part. Getting to watch you write it. Something warm unfurled in her chest. Not love. Not exactly. But possibility. Hope. The tentative belief that she could be more than a woman running from her past. I'm thinking of planting roses, she said suddenly. Sarah's seeds. I found rose seeds. Seems foolish. Planting flowers when vegetables would be more practical. Plant them. Beauty's practical in its own way. You won't mind. Why would I mind? He seemed genuinely puzzled. Your garden, your choice. Your choice, such simple words, but they rang like bells in her chest. Her choice, her garden, her life to shape as she saw fit. I'll plant them tomorrow, she decided, and vegetables too, carrots and beans and whatever else might grow here. I'll help with the heavy work. Breaking ground's harder than it looks. We'll do it together then. Together, he agreed. And the word carried weight, carried promise, carried all the unspoken things growing between them like those seeds waiting in packets. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Lydia stood in the yard, marking out her garden plot. The earth was dark and rich where the snow had melted. Ready for planting, ready for new life. She thought of Samuel, somewhere in a pine box, being shipped back to Missouri. Thought of the life she'd have lived as his wife. Small, constrained, always afraid. That version of Lydia was as dead as he was, and she wouldn't mourn either one. Instead, she pushed the spade into earth, beginning the work of creating something new. Cullen joined her, and they worked in companionable silence, breaking ground for dreams neither of them could fully name yet. By noon, they had the plot ready. Lydia opened Sarah's seed packets with reverent hands. Her sister-in-law that never was had labeled everything in careful script: roses, red climbers, beans, plant after last frost, herbs for kitchen. She would have loved this, Cullen said softly, seeing her seeds finally planted. They're not just her seeds now, Lydia replied. They're ours, yours and mine, new life from old dreams. She pressed the first seeds into soil, covered them gently. Such a simple act, but it felt momentous. She was planting roots, both literal and metaphorical, claiming this piece of earth as home, at least for now. What are you thinking? Cullen asked, watching her face. That Samuel was wrong. I'm not damaged goods. I'm not anybody's leavings. She met his eyes. I'm Lydia Grace Alcott, and I'm planting a garden in Montana. I'm learning to ranch. I'm singing again. I'm choosing my own life. She took a breath. And I'm not running anymore.
No, he agreed. You're not running, you're growing.
We both are. Maybe so. They finished planting as the afternoon sun slanted gold across the land. Rows of possibility, waiting to push through earth toward sky. It would take time, patience, faith that tiny seeds could become something beautiful and sustaining. But Lydia had learned about patience, had learned about faith. Too, not the kind preached from pulpits, but the quieter kind found in daily choices, in deciding to stay when you could run, in planting gardens when you'd only known scorched earth. That night, she wrote to Margaret. Not the full truth. Some stories were too heavy for letters. But enough. I am safe. I am well. I am learning who I am when no one is telling me who to be. The man I was to marry is dead, and I am free. I have found work and purpose and perhaps something more. When you see me again, and you will, someday, you may not recognize me. I barely recognize myself, but I like who I'm becoming. She sealed the letter, addressed it to California, and dreams deferred, but not forgotten. Then she joined Cullen by the fire, picking up mending while he worked on harness leather. Read something? She asked suddenly. From one of your books, Sarah's books? He looked surprised, but pleased. Any preference? Something hopeful, something about starting over. He selected a worn volume of poetry, thumbed through pages. Here, Whitman. Sarah marked this one. His voice was deep, thoughtful. As he read about leaves of grass and songs of the open road, Lydia let the words wash over her, thinking of Samuel in his grave, of seeds in dark earth, of the way some endings were really beginnings in disguise. When he finished, they sat in peaceful silence. Outside, night creatures called to each other. Inside, the fire crackled and the lamp cast golden circles on rough walls that had become home. Thank you, she said, for reading, for everything, for being patient while I figure out how to be this, whoever this is. Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Neither was she, Lydia realized. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she'd chosen this place, this life, this careful dance of two damaged people learning to trust again. Tomorrow she'd water her seeds. Tomorrow she'd work on fences and tend cattle and maybe sing a little louder. Tomorrow she'd continue becoming whoever Lydia Grace Alcott was meant to be. But tonight, she was content to sit by the fire with a good man, mending what was torn, and believing in the possibility of roses. The summer evening was soft as silk, stars just beginning to show in a sky still painted with sunset. Lydia sat on the porch steps, her garden spread before her in the growing dusk, beans climbing their poles, tomatoes heavy on the vine, and yes, the first buds on Sarah's roses, red as promises. She'd been here 4 months now, 4 months of learning and growing, of finding her voice and her strength. The woman who'd collapsed in the snow seemed like someone from another lifetime. This Lydia had calluses on her hands from real work, sun gold on her skin, and a way of moving through the world like she belonged in it. Letter came, Cullen said, joining her on the steps. He handed her the envelope, addressed in Margaret's careful script. Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, her sister's words were full of joy and worry in equal measure. The boarding house position was still available if she wanted it. Margaret had even found a small cottage she could rent nearby. Come whenever you're ready. The letter ended. California is beautiful, but it would be more beautiful with you here. Good news, Cullen asked. though something in his voice suggested he already knew. The position in San Francisco. It's still waiting for me. She folded the letter carefully. Margaret says I could start next month if I wanted. That's what you were aiming for. Wasn't it California New Beginning? It was. She traced the edge of the paper. Funny how plans change. They sat in silence, watching fireflies begin their ancient dance. The evening was so peaceful, so perfectly itself, that Lydia wanted to cup it in her hands like water. Hold it forever. I should go, she said finally. It's what I planned, what I promised myself. What makes sense. Should isn't always the same as want. No, she agreed. It's not. So, what do you want? Lydia. The question hung in the air between them. What did she want for so long? She'd only wanted to escape, to survive, to make it through another day. But now, with Samuel gone and her freedom assured, what did she actually want? I want to see my roses bloom, she said slowly. I want to bring in the harvest from seeds I planted. I want to learn to break a horse proper, the way you've been teaching me. She turned to look at him. I want to stop running towards something and start building something instead. Those sound like roots talking. Maybe they are. She set Margaret's letter aside. Would it be so terrible to put down roots here? Not terrible at all. His voice was rougher than usual. Been hoping you might consider it. Just for my cooking skills. Among other things. He shifted to face her more fully. Lydia, I need to say something. And I need you to know there's no obligation in it. No expectation. Just truth. Her heart picked up speed. All right. When Sarah died, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd had my chance at family, at building something with someone, and lost it. Figured I'd work this land alone until I couldn't anymore. He paused, choosing words carefully. Then you showed up, half frozen and scared of your own shadow, and everything I thought I knew got turned sideways. Cullen, let me finish, please. He took a breath. I'm not a man of pretty words. Don't know how to court proper. Don't have much to offer except hard work and simple living. But I know what I feel when I see you in the morning sun. Know what I think when I hear you singing while you work. Know that this place feels more like home with you in it than it ever did before. Lydia's eyes burned with unshed tears. What are you saying? I'm saying stay. Not as my housekeeper, not as someone passing through. Stay as whatever you want to be to me. Partner, companion. He swallowed hard. Wife, if that word doesn't scare you too much after everything. You're asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to think about it, to consider building something together. Real partners, equal in everything. He touched her hand gently. I know what marriage meant before. Know why you ran. This wouldn't be that, would never be that. Lydia looked at their joined hands, his rough from years of work, hers bearing new calluses she'd earned herself. Such different hands than they'd been that night in the snow. I don't know if I know how, she whispered. To be a wife again. To trust that much. Don't need to know how. Just need to be willing to try. We'd figure it out together. Same as we've figured out everything else. And if I can't, if the word wife always makes me remember, then we'll find another word, or no word at all. Don't need labels to know what we're building here. She thought about California, about the life waiting there, safe, respectable, everything she'd thought she wanted. Then she looked around at this place that had become home without her noticing, the garden she'd planted, the horses that knew her voice, the man beside her who'd never once tried to make her smaller than she was. I need time, she said, to think, to be sure I'm choosing this for the right reasons. Take all the time you need. Offer doesn't expire. She squeezed his hand. Can I ask you something? Anything. That first night, when you found me in the snow, why did you stop really? He was quiet for a long moment. Because I recognized something in you. The look of someone who'd been broken by another person's choices. Same look Sarah had when she first came. He met her eyes. And maybe the same look I had after that stampede. Seemed like fate, finding someone else who understood that particular kind of damage.
Is that what we are, two damaged people holding each other up?
Maybe that's how we started, but I think we're more than that now. Think we're two people who've learned that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, that you can build something beautiful with imperfect pieces if you're careful about how they fit together. The truth of it settled into her bones. They were building something. Had been since that first night, not a rescue, not charity, but a partnership born of mutual understanding and quiet strength. "I'll write to Margaret," she said. "Tell her I need more time to decide." "That's fair."
"But Cullen," she turned to face him fully.
"I don't think I'm going to California."
His smile was slow, spreading like sunrise.
No. Seems I've already found what I was looking for. Just took me a while to recognize it." He lifted her hand, pressed it gently to his lips. Such a simple gesture, but it made her feel more cherished than all of Samuel's elaborate courtship ever had.
"No rush," he said again. "We've got time."
"We do," she agreed. "All the time we need."
They sat together as full dark settled over the ranch, comfortable in their silence and their understanding. Inside the house, cold food waited on the table, forgotten in the weight of more important things, but neither moved to go in. This moment, balanced on the edge of decision, felt too precious to abandon.
"I want to court you proper,"
Cullen said suddenly.
"Whatever that means to you, whatever makes you feel safe and valued."
"You've been courting me since the day you gave me your coat,"
Lydia replied. "Every patient moment, every quiet kindness, that's worth more than flowers and pretty speeches."
"Still, you deserve to be courted like you matter, because you do."
"Then court me," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "But know that I'm courting you too. This goes both ways. Cullen Hart, equal partners, like you said."
"I can live with that."
A coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The night sounds of the ranch surrounded them, horses shifting in the barn, wind in the grass, the creek running steady and sure. It was a symphony of home, of belonging, of life continuing its ancient patterns. "I should probably go in," Lydia said eventually. "Early morning tomorrow." "Probably should." But neither moved. Instead, they sat a while longer, hands linked, watching stars emerge in all their brilliant multitude. Lydia thought of Sarah's half-finished sampler, "Home is where," and finally understood what the ending might have been. Home is where you choose to plant your garden, where you hang your hopes on rose vines and bean poles, where someone sees you clearly and loves what they see, where broken doesn't mean worthless and scared doesn't mean weak. Home is where you stop running and start growing instead. "Cullen," she said softly. "Ask me again. In the fall, after the harvest, after we see what we've grown together. Ask me then."
"I will," he promised. "Every season if you need me to, until you're ready to say yes."
"And if I'm never ready for the word wife?"
"Then I'll ask if you'll be my partner, my companion, my fellow gardener. Whatever word feels right to you." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady breathing of a man who knew how to wait for good things to grow in their own time.
"I think I could love you," she whispered, "if I remember how, if I'm brave enough."
"You're the bravest person I know," he replied.
"And love isn't something you remember. It's something you choose, every day, in all the small ways.
We've been choosing it for months now.
I think just didn't have the words for it." Maybe he was right. Maybe love was in the coffee she made each morning, in the way he always left the best chair for her, in the garden they'd planted together and the future they were carefully tending. "Stay here with me a little longer," she asked.
"Long as you want," he said.
And she knew he meant not just tonight, but all the nights to come. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient, and below them, Two people who'd learned that sometimes the best journey was the one that brought you home, sat together on porch steps, writing their own story one careful word at a time. Spring came again to Montana, painting the hillsides with wildflowers and filling the air with birds' song. A full year had passed since Lydia had stumbled into Cedar Hollow, and now she moved through the ranch with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The roses had bloomed spectacularly the previous summer, climbing the fence posts in cascades of red. She'd dried some petals, keeping them in a jar on the kitchen shelf, a reminder that beautiful things could grow from desperate beginnings. This morning, she was working in the expanded garden when she heard riders approaching. Two women on horseback, dressed in traveling clothes, looking weary but determined. Something about the younger one's posture protective, wary, made Lydia's heart clench with recognition. "Can I help you?" she called, setting aside her tools. "We're looking for the Hart Ranch," the older woman said. "We're told in town that you might have work available." Lydia studied them more carefully. The younger woman had a bruise fading on her jaw, partially hidden by her bonnet. Her eyes held that particular emptiness Lydia knew too well, the look of someone who'd learned to make themselves small to survive. "You've found it," Lydia said gently. "Come inside. You look like you could use some coffee and food." Cullen emerged from the barn as they dismounted. He took in the scene with one glance, then simply said, "I'll see to your horses." Inside, Lydia busied herself with hospitality while the women sat stiffly at her table. The older one, Mrs. Patterson. She introduced herself, did most of the talking. They were sisters from Nebraska, looking for work, any kind of honest work. "And you traveled all this way alone?" Lydia asked. Mrs. Patterson's jaw tightened. "Our circumstances required it. My sister Ellen, she recently lost her husband." Ellen flinched at the words, and Lydia saw the truth written in that small motion. Lost, perhaps, but not to death. At least not the kind that came with funerals and condolences. "I'm sorry for your loss," Lydia said carefully. Then, meeting Ellen's eyes, "Starting over is hard, but it's possible, I know." Something flickered in the younger woman's face. Hope. Maybe, or just recognition that here was someone who understood. Cullen came in then, hanging his hat by the door. "Horses are settled. Good animals, well cared for. We didn't steal them." "Mrs. Patterson said quickly. "Didn't think you did." He poured himself coffee, casual and calm. "Question is what you're looking for here." "Work." Ellen spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere safe to work." Lydia and Cullen exchanged a look. They'd talked about this, about how the ranch was growing, how they could use extra hands, but more than that, they'd talked about paying forward the kindness that had saved Lydia's life. "We've been thinking about hiring help," Cullen said slowly. "Ranch is doing well. Could use someone who knows their way around a kitchen garden. Maybe help with the chickens we're planning to get." "I can do that," Ellen said quickly. "I can cook, sew, tend gardens. I'm not afraid of hard work." "What about you, Mrs. Patterson?" Lydia asked. "I've kept books for my late husband's business. I can read, write, do figures." She hesitated. "But if you need me to work the land, I can learn." Cullen nodded thoughtfully. "Been drowning in paperwork lately. Never was good with numbers. Could use someone to help get the accounts straight." And just like that, it was decided. They had a small cabin on the property, originally built for hired hands they'd never gotten around to hiring. It needed work, but it was sound, with its own stove and 2 small bedrooms. As Lydia helped them settle in, Ellen caught her arm. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't know us. We could be anyone." "I know enough," Lydia said. "I know you're running from something that hurt you. I know you're brave enough to leave. I know you need a chance to find out who you are when no one's forcing you to be less than you deserve." Tears spilled down Ellen's cheeks. "Does it get better, the fear?
the way sounds make you jump. It does, not all at once, but it does. Lydia squeezed her hand. You're safe here. That's the first step. That evening, after the sisters had retired to their cabin, Lydia and Cullen sat on their porch now, though no ceremony had made it official yet. You did a good thing today, he said. We did, together. She leaned against him, comfortable with the closeness now. Made me think about when I first came here, how different everything might have been if you'd turned me away. Never would have happened. How can you be so sure? He was quiet for a moment. Because I'd been waiting. Didn't know it, but I'd been waiting for something to change, someone to help me remember why the work mattered. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Found more than I was looking for. Cullen, she turned to face him. Ask me. Ask you what? You know what? You said you'd ask again after the harvest. It's been 2 harvests now. His eyes searched hers. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. She took his hands. I don't need the word wife if it still frightens me sometimes. But I need you to know that I choose this, choose you, choose us, whatever words we use for it. He slid from the chair to one knee. There on the porch they'd built together. Lydia Grace Alcott, will you build a life with me? Will you be my partner, my equal, my love? Will you marry me in whatever way feels right to you? Yes, she said, the word coming easy as breathing. Yes, to all of it. He stood and kissed her, sweet and sure, while the stars came out overhead. When they parted, both were smiling like fools. When? He asked. Soon, but simple. Just us and perhaps the minister. The sisters, if they'd like. She touched his face. I don't need a big ceremony. Just need to know it's real, that it's ours. Next week, give you time to make a dress if you want. Next week, she agreed. They were married the following Saturday. In the garden Lydia had planted. Ellen stood as her witness, still fragile but growing stronger each day. Mrs. Patterson played an old hymn on the fiddle she'd brought from Nebraska. The minister kept it brief, understanding that sometimes the simplest ceremonies held the deepest meanings. Lydia wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself, with Sarah's roses in her hair. Cullen wore his best shirt and a look of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. When the minister asked if anyone objected, a meadowlark sang from the fence post, and everyone laughed. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister said, then added with a smile, or, as I understand you prefer, partners in all things. They kissed there among the beans and roses, surrounded by growth they'd nurtured together. No fear, no shadows from the past. Just 2 people who'd learned that love wasn't possession but partnership, wasn't control but care. That night, as they lay together in the bed they now openly shared, Lydia traced patterns on Cullen's chest. No regrets, she asked. Only that it took so long to find you. Maybe it had to. Maybe we both needed to break first, to understand how to build something that wouldn't break others. He pulled her closer. Speaking of building, I've been thinking about adding onto the house, another bedroom or 2. Planning for more hired hands. Or other additions, someday, if you want. The thought of children didn't terrify her the way it once had. With Cullen, the idea of family meant something different. Meant choice and joy and little ones raised to be themselves, not shaped by fear. Someday, she agreed. But not yet. Want you to myself a while longer. I can live with that. They fell asleep to the sound of night birds and wind in the grass. 2 people who'd found home not in a place, but in each other. Months later, when Ellen had grown confident enough to sing while she worked, when the ranch had prospered enough to hire 2 more hands, when Lydia's belly had begun to round with new life, she stood in her garden among the blooming roses. She thought of that night in the snow, shaking with cold and terror. Thought of Cullen's voice saying, "Then sleep in my arms tonight. Not a demand, but an offer. Not ownership, but shelter."
They'd built so much from that moment. A home, a haven, a life that welcomed other broken souls and helped them heal. The woman she'd been couldn't have imagined the woman she'd become. "You all right?" Cullen asked, joining her among the flowers. "Perfect," she said, leaning back against him, his hands settling gently on her growing belly. "Absolutely perfect." And she was, not because life was without challenges. The ranch still demanded hard work. The memories sometimes still surfaced in dreams. The future held no guarantees. But because she'd learned the secret Samuel never understood, that Cullen had always known, love wasn't about making someone smaller to fit your life. It was about growing together until your lives became one garden, tended by willing hands and careful hearts, blooming in its own time and its own way. The roses climbed higher on their posts, reaching for the sky, and Lydia Grace Hart, for she'd taken his name gladly in the end, hummed as she worked, her voice strong and clear and free, a song of her own making in a life of her own choosing. Home, as it turned out, was exactly where she'd planted it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what you thought about Lydia and Cullen's journey. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover this story. Your support means everything and helps keep these frontier tales alive.